Hi students, I'm here on Friday recording this lecture for you on Chapter 2. I hope that it will help you as you prepare to take the quizzes or the test. I haven't really checked to see how many of you have attempted that so far, but I hope the lecture repeats some of the good ideas in the chapter that you'll need to recognize and understand in order to be successful taking the test. So what we're talking about is stereotypes and images, and I think this is great to be able to do the lecture now after we've had our guests in our class on Thursday. These were women who really debunked a lot of stereotypes that we might have, held loosely in our minds, and I love the way that they presented themselves. So I'll try to make reference to them as we go along in the lecture, just to make some of those points connect for you. So I'm going to look at my lecture outline. The first little bit of the lecture outline for Chapter 2 sort of asks us, like all the time it does, to define our terms and think about what it is that we're actually going to be discussing. So here we go. Why do human beings create stereotypes? And sometimes when I talk about this, I like to think about how my brain works and how our human development and adaptation with our brain happens when we recognize patterns of things that occur over and over again. And so part of the reason that we develop stereotypes is an adaptive response, within our thinking, so that we recognize things repeatedly and we don't have to relearn a new thing each time we see it. So I guess a more benign idea here would be when a child learns what a ball is. A child first, gets taught the word ball as his or her parent holds a little ball out and plays with the child. A very young child will go to the grocery store and see an orange, and you know what I'm going to say. The child will then say ball. And the parent has to start teaching the child to discriminate between a round object that has a bright color, an orange, which is a piece of food. They need to learn to discriminate that from a plastic toy called a ball. And so that's a kind of a simple example of how our brain makes a connection to something that we see, and then makes, we in our mind connect things that look the same. So in a way, that is a short explanation of how the adaptive nature of recognizing a shape, a form, color, other kinds of aspects of something that we see. So now if we take that idea to our understanding of what a stereotype could be, we can see why if we teach a child what an old person is, an elderly person is, then they will see each elderly person as old. And actually we, of course we do that in our lives. And so I guess I'm trying to introduce the notion that the beginnings of forming stereotypes are not always a negative thing, that it's actually sort of a brain learning adaptive response. So the downside, of course, of using stereotypes to understand groups of people that we meet is that they are based on pretty much on old knowledge, prior knowledge. And so if we're not open to learning about new samples of this grouping we have in our mind, then we can not accommodate a new understanding of how a person might relate. So I guess if you think of any kind of grouping of people, males, females, old people, young people, babies, cultural groups, professional people, any kind of categorization that you might make, think about it. If we lump all those people into one definition of how they're going to be, then that's it's not really very helpful to us if we're not open to perceiving someone unique and new. So if stereotypes remain rigid, they limit us, and they limit us in many ways as a culture, and they limit us as individuals too as we interact with people. So here we're talking about senior adults, and the women who were great to visit us on Thursday were super examples of senior adults who can, you know, broaden our understanding of what living is like for them. So I loved that these women were very open to using technology and learning new things. And not only that, but they were open to teaching themselves. They certainly knew how to use a person in their life who could teach them how to use a smartphone, for example. But they also were willing to just educate themselves, use trial and error, access educational opportunities to learn new things, such as at the community college, about computers and so on. So I think that was a great way of letting us see the opposite stereotype to when we say old people don't want to really learn anything new, or they can't learn new, or they won't use computers and so on. So I guess I want to go back to the idea of some downsides to stereotypes. We also could be willing to ignore new information that proves us wrong just to hold on to our stereotype. So if there's anything that we can learn about stereotypes in senior adults, I think it would be that we should remain open and not keep a rigid sense of what a senior adult is like based on some older information or older experiences even that you may have had in your work life. There's some interesting information in your book, and it of course appears on the test too, about the nature of stereotypes, that there could be different categories of stereotypes. Positive stereotypes exist, negative obviously exist, and then there's even something called compassionate stereotyping. So we'll look at that in just a little while here. So on category B of your lecture outline, it says positive and negative stereotypes, and I want to just talk with you about that right now. So stereotypes in general, though, about senior adults are changing, and they are becoming more positive. So that's great. Research seems to show that senior adults are being depicted in more, more varied ways and more in a more positive light, instead of some of our older methods of looking and depicting old people. So we think that part of this is probably due to having more exposure to elderly adults, because so many more senior adults are living longer and generally living more successfully, generally enjoying better health, and generally becoming more active, just as our entire culture really, I think, is trying to become a little bit more active. The senior adults in our culture are a part of that group, and so we're seeing them do more things than maybe 40 years ago. So what are some of the negative stereotypes? And we can all, if we were sitting in class together, I would ask us to call some out probably, but we all know what those probably would be. But there have been some recent studies, and I have these noted in my lecture notes, that these studies that are cited are mainly from the 90s. But when they ask people, tell us what you think a descriptor is for an old person, you might hear words like ugly, or they're in mental decline, or senility, or slow drivers, or poor decision makers, or frail. You can think stuck in the old days. I can just hear people saying some things like that. As you do your exercise that was given to you on Thursday, asking 3 people that you meet to describe age groups, pay attention to what kind of responses you get for the aged category. And you may, start to see some of the kinds of descriptors that I just mentioned to you. So the 2 main kinds of negative or negativism that I want to talk about those, with regard to senior adults. There is an attitude of biomedicalization as it refers to keeping senior adults in this stereotype. It kind of traps them in there. So this idea of biomedicalization is where a person views the aging process as only caused by biology versus social and behavioral. Let me say that again so you can kind of think about that. This is biomedicalization would be the attitude of viewing aging as only a biological process. So you can assume that if we were looking at senior adults that way, we would be thinking about decrements or losses. Losses in hearing, losses in bladder control, losses in memory, losses in muscle strength, and so on and so on and so on. So that is a biomedicalization attitude. But think about social and behavioral aging. You know, the sort of the effect that on aging from a social and behavioral perspective. This can be a way of looking at aging where a person has more impact on how aging happens for him or her, because they can make choices about their behaviors, not staying in the house as often, or volunteering, or getting up and out as these visitors to our class did. So there is a social and behavioral aspect to aging which really gives more control to the senior adult in terms of how they're going to age. So in addition to changes that happen to our biology, we also, as aging people, can have an effect for the positive, is what I'm trying to get at, I guess. Another type of attitude is called compassionate stereotyping. And you might think, oh, compassionate stereotyping, that sounds a little more positive. But this is actually more of a pitying attitude about the elderly. So we might think, oh, look at those poor old people. They really can't move very fast, can they? They're not getting around very well anymore, are they? Those kinds of things where we are feeling kind of sorry for them. The problem with compassionate stereotyping is that it perpetuates the stereotype, and it perpetuates the idea that senior adults are dependent on us. And it creates lowered expectations for seniors. So that's kind of interesting to think about, compassionate stereotyping. So it discounts their abilities, it discounts their strengths, it might discount their contributions, or the ability to make contributions in a culture. And they, you know, in my notes I have, senior adults don't want our pity. They want to be helped to remain independent. And so if we think about, you know, some of the things that we're going to be learning in class as pieces of information that would be helpful if you ever were to work with senior adults, you know, being aware of the lack of the negative stereotype of compassionate stereotyping, like what that does to a senior adult, can, if we think about it and we pay attention to it and try to change our behaviors, we can not pity seniors. We can look for ways that seniors have strengths. It can cause a good attitudinal change, and that's one of the reasons for you having to even take this entire course in our curriculum, actually. So we've talked about negative stereotyping. That's easy to understand. We've talked about biomedicalization attitude or stereotyping. We just had some discussion about compassionate stereotyping. And here's another one, positive stereotyping. And you might think again, well, what would be wrong with positive stereotyping? Well, here's the thing. It is a way of looking at senior adults in a more positive light, but sometimes positive stereotyping can sort of gloss over sort of the variety of the individuals in a population of older adults. So for example, if you line up 100 older adults and you just think of them all as, oh, look at these guys, they're probably all the greatest grandparents ever. Well, that is not going to be true, because you have 100 individuals, just like you're an individual, and people in your age group are individuals. People who rise to be seniors in our culture are also all individuals. And so while most of them may love being grandparents, some of them might be very unkind or damaging grandparents. So it's not fair for us to put that expectation on them, really. Some other kinds of phrases that are used to describe senior adults that would be, which would be called positive stereotyping, could be being golden agers. Oh, these people are in their golden years. Well, that kind of glosses over the specific needs and trials of some seniors. So I think you can understand why even positive stereotyping is something that we ought to watch out for. So now on my lecture outline I have, let's see, well, at least in my notes, I have where do we get our stereotypes? And part of that is, as I mentioned to you at the beginning of this lecture, part of that comes from our experience. Our experience in being exposed to senior adults, or seeing them in magazines, or watching them through the grocery store, or being exposed to them in our churches, or as drivers, or in public places. So part of where our stereotypes start to come from is our own personal experience. Another place that has a huge effect on us is the media. And when we watch media, we are being given information that often is very stereotypical, particularly about older adults. And there's an interesting study that's cited in your book that discusses how the more senior adults watch television, the worse they feel about themselves in culture. Isn't that something? The more they watch television, the worse they are measured to feel about being an elderly adult. And part of that is believed to be because of the way they're depicted in our culture, in the media. So unfortunately, the media reinforces a lot of negative stereotypes that we have about seniors. So I would challenge you actually to think about and search for television shows that don't depict seniors in a super stereotypical way. One show that comes to my mind, which is kind of old now, is called Golden Girls. And as I recall, there's several personalities in that grouping, and they're all kind of different, but they don't meet the requirements or the stereotypical requirements of perfect golden age people. Actually, a friend of mine just recently told me about a television show that's on Netflix. Oh, I think it's called Franny and Somebody, but it is about, Jane Fonda's in it actually, and it's she and another woman in their senior years as senior adults, and Jane Fonda certainly is a senior adult now. She's certainly over the age of 60, 65. So I'm going to hunt that down on Netflix and see if I can watch it, but my understanding is that it's a really sort of modern look at senior adults. So check that out if you have a chance to look at that. All right, I'm just going to check my camera and make sure that it's still rolling, so hang on, you guys. Okay, we're still going. It seems to knock off sometimes, just maybe it thinks that we're not recording anymore, so I'll move it a little bit. Okay, defining old. How do we define what old is? Well, in history, in even the last 100, 150 years, the life expectancy for people, even in the United States, was really not very high. So people really, 50-ish was considered old because people didn't live into their 80s and 90s as much as they do now. Another way that history has had an effect on what we consider to be old is the instituting in 1935 of the Social Security Act. And so At that time, now this is 1935, Social Security was instated, and the age of 65 was the age where people could access retirement benefits. And we aren't too far from 65 now, although now they're inching it up. I as a 57-year-old person, am not qualified to collect retirement benefits until I'm 67. I think it's even inched up further for some people who are younger than me, maybe 70. So getting back to the main point though, one of the historical effects of us looking at what old is, or defining old, certainly in the United States, is the Social Security Act. So let's think about this though. Nowadays, 65 is very different. Even the age 65 is very different from what 50 was back then in 1935. And so 65-year-olds are, gosh, more active, more vibrant, more involved still. And a lot of that, I think, is because healthcare has just gotten better and better and better and better, and our nutrition has gotten better and better and better, and disease prevention, disease control. People are not as exhausted by some of the disease processes that occur in old age. So we see really a more healthful population of early seniors. Now we would start to call a 65-year-old senior adult the young old, and I would put that in, quotation marks. So here's an interesting question to think about. Should we really, as a culture, redefine old? And are we actually already doing that? Are we thinking about, when you think about old, do you think about a 65-year-old person? Do you think about a 70-year-old person? Or do you think about an 80, 85-year-old person? That would be interesting to hear you talk about in the classroom. So let's talk a little bit now about psychological functioning as it relates to aging. And so when I'm talking about psychological functioning here, I'm wanting to make us consider the processes of thinking, processing information, memory storage. And this type of functioning, this type of psychological functioning is definitely genetically programmed. And so there is some part of our change in our mental processing as we age, and some portion of that can be attributed to genetic programming. Retention of memory or development of dementia at a certain age. Some of those things we know now to be tied to genetics. But that's not the end of the story for senior adults. Senior adults can still work against some of those declines by stimulating themselves, by learning new kinds of information, by doing puzzles, by even stimulating themselves by walking or driving a different way home, so that they're seeing routes in new ways. And if you think about that from a mental processing perspective, that's kind of interesting, really. So mental decline doesn't have to happen in terms of psychological functioning. I mean, sometimes it will happen, for example, the development of Alzheimer's or dementia, but it's not a foregone conclusion that it must happen and that it can't be postponed in a way by keeping one's mind very active and challenged. I think one of the things that you may notice on television, there's advertising now for an application that you can use either on your phone or on your computer that has brain puzzles. I can't remember the name of this company, but it's really pretty cool. Whoever devised this idea as a business model was right on the money in terms of the baby boomers coming along and this large group of people that you might actually sell something to. Think about it. They're selling games to stimulate your mind. Well, we can really do that on our own. by doing crossword puzzles, by learning new card games that involve numbers and space and learning new skills. We can do all of that really kind of on our own, but somebody has developed a great product for that. Okay, I want to talk with you about something that's mentioned on the test, I know, and it's called developmental reserve capacity. And this again has, it's related to psychological functioning, learning, memory, and so on. So researchers have discovered that older adults can develop and learn in their older years. So it isn't true that adults can't learn, senior adults can't learn new things. It might be challenging for them to learn new things, but it's not impossible. So there is definitely in their learning process some change in terms of loss of speed, quantity of information that might be remembered easily. Those things could be different from when they were in their 40s or in their 30s. However, recent research indicates that senior adults, when they're learning something new, they use their practical wisdom, they use practical skills and experience to integrate that new knowledge so that it can be stored in their memory. And so this is called pragmatic knowledge. And if I remember right, when I took the quiz, I think there was a question or two related to this. So this all has to do with that idea about learning and the capacity for learning new things, and how do senior adults, when they come into a learning environment or they try to teach themselves something new, how do they use their already established practical knowledge to integrate new information? Because they have to kind of use it as a support system, if you will. All right, item number 3 on the lecture outline is how do aged adults obtain their self-concept, and how is self-concept affected by outside forces? So once again, I'm just going to check the camera and make sure that it's still on. Hold on, you guys. Yeah. Okay, it's still running, so I don't want to have to do this lecture one more time. So getting back to Roman numeral 3 on your lecture outline, how do they develop their self-concepts? So part of this is called the social construction of aging. Think about that, the social construction of aging. When I hear that word social, in my mind it means that maybe my construction of aging is going to be affected by society. And so I think that is exactly the point of this phrase, the social construction of aging. Because we are social beings. Human beings are social beings. We relate to others, we notice others, we have the capacity to perceive in our brains. We can perceive what others' facial expressions are like, and so we can perceive other people's attitudes towards us. And so senior adults do this too, of course. And so they are affected by how others encounter them in life. And so let's see, they will take in the positive views that we have of them as seniors. They'll also, of course, take in the negative views and attitudes, and what sort of even compassionate, kind of pitying views that we might have towards them. And so part of the self-concept that seniors get comes from outside of them, from, the world and our culture. Another thing that's important though to understand is that self-concept, your self-concept, my self-concept, and certainly the concept of senior adults, is formed and maintained by their own experiences. So while they may be treated as if they are mentally deficient or slow or have poor reaction time, if they actually have, if they're quite agile and their minds are very sharp and so on, they're going to also take in that information and develop self-concept based on that. And so here's an important thing for us to remember. Elders who are able to keep their self-concept fairly consistent